So we have always, I think always, if I remember right, done an invited panel as part of this conference. And at least from my perspective, I see this as a way to learn more about the work that different members of the community are doing around some theme and have sort of the beginnings of a very interesting conversation about what people are doing in QE, what they're finding exciting, and how they're seeing things, intersect in interesting ways in their work. So hopefully this panel discussion, which will occupy for the next hour or so, is actually just the beginning of a conversation that we'll be able to continue throughout the rest of the conference. And I really encourage everyone to connect with the panelists over the next several days and talk to them more about their work and the kinds of things that they're interested in. In designing the panel for this year, we thought a good theme for discussion might be actually around practice and policy. In the sort of early years of QE, there's been a lot of research on authentic practice and increasingly work on policy as well. There's been a lot less research for practice and policy, research that sort of directly informs or contributes to those topics. And so we brought together a panel of experts who Amanda already helped to introduce to talk a little bit about this in their own work. So just a little bit about how we're going to structure the session. Essentially, I'm going to ask each panelist a sort of individualized question that will give them a chance to kind of introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their work and their thoughts on this topic. We then have a few prepared questions that all the panelists are welcome to comment on and discuss. And then we'll have some time at the end for audience questions. So make sure that you're thinking of things that you may want to ask them. And again, like I said, hopefully we'll have plenty of time throughout the conference for you to engage individually as well. I think we're going to aim to end the discussion probably about 10:35, 10:40, because I know at least several of us have to go to the next session and do presentations and need to go get set up for that. But again, hopefully there will be lots of opportunities for continuing the discussion. So why don't we just go ahead and launch in. Like I said, we'll start with some intros. So Juan, you recently launched a global initiative to expand research in digital anthropology. Can you tell us a little bit about the work and why you find QE compelling?
Sure. Is it okay if I talk this loud? Good morning to everyone, and thanks to all the organizers for inviting me to the conference. This community is really welcoming, so I'm very glad to be here. Just as a short presentation, I'm an engineer by training, but my career has been in policy. I think in every step of the policy cycle, from lawmaking, working in Congress and the government, rulemaking, that dark space that no one knows about between laws and implementation of policy, where a lot of things happen and very influential, but really no one cares about. The design, implementation, evaluation in policies in the Ministry of Labor of my country, so pretty much in the full process, even in the electoral process for a little bit. So I'm happy to contribute to the conversation from that end. As Andrew was saying, now I'm in UNESCO on this program to advance digital anthropology. By digital anthropology, we mean that space of interaction between technology and culture, where ethnography has a lot to do, but also digital methods contribute to understand society in a better way. And it's a mix of, on the one hand, how are we going to improve the way that we understand society with these methods, but on the other hand, how are we going to bring anthropological perspectives to understand what's happening in society in this process of digitalization. In that world, what we're doing is finding tools and methods and trying to expand them into the decision-making process and trying to fill that big gap between policy-making and the scientific evolution that you're having in this discipline. We find the QE community extremely attractive on that space because you are working in that intersection and also you're helping us to provide meaning and interpretation to the models that are being created all over the public sector without really understanding what's going on and what are the causalities and what's really happening, in fact. And we also see a large contribution from your community in the way that we develop technology. So the process that you have of interrogating your models and your variables using ethnography, but at the same time using technology to improve your own understanding. This cycle is something that we think we need to teach the public sector to do. And of course, we see a lot of potential also in changing the way the policy-making cycle works. We have a lot of influence from economics and data science into that cycle, and not a lot of influence from political studies. So this, the QE community might be a way to intervene in that cycle.
Great, thanks. So Nancy, you've used QE methods to understand how applicants for disability benefits understand their experiences. Can you tell us a little bit about why you use QE methods in this?
Sure, thank you. Again, thank you to the program committee for inviting me to join this panel. I have to start with a little bit of the history of how I came into this particular field, because I'm a consumer psychologist and I apply psychological theories to understand mostly consumer decision making in the areas of financial decisions, healthcare, and sustainability. So I first actually conducted this study. I think they were all funded by the Social Security Administration in 2011, when sort of like during the depth of the last financial crisis. And so we were looking at like 11 million applicants. That was, I think, at the highest point annually for people who apply for these benefits. And so I was, at the time, my focus wasn't actually looking at Social Security alone. I was looking at the healthcare benefits that people were applying to, in addition to all sorts of other financial issues, because that was a time of crisis. And we scraped data. That was at its infancy. We actually had to use data, licensed software to be able to scrape those data, and then we had a huge amount of data. As I was going through that, my co-author and I were only familiar with traditional qualitative coding methods. So we were only able to code like just maybe 10% of the amount of textual data that we received, that we scraped from online forum. And on that basis, I was able to detect some really influential things that were in the data, but I wasn't able to, due to the lack of time and opportunity. We just sort of completed our report, submitted it to the funder, and we really did not make much out of it since then. And 10 years later, we received another round of call for funding from Social Security Administration that now that the applications are declining. So it went from the height of like about almost 11 million a year to about 9 million, if not 10 million. And they're still trying to understand what is going on here. So I just decided that now that I have a co-author who actually is familiar with, I think, text analysis and some of this data scraping methods. So I said, you know what, I think it's time for me to repeat this study again, but with the help of AI and QE. And that was kind of how we started working on this. And this time around, we are able to analyze data to the QE methods. And it is really startling. I think the key contribution, for this methodology is really, see, the governments, they can only derive the data from administrative data and large-scale surveys. But these are all questions and things that they collect for their own administrative purposes, but it doesn't speak to the other side of the issue in terms of the consumer experiences as they're going through that process. So as a matter of, statistically speaking, so of that 10 million applicants annually, more than 60% of them are rejected in the first round. So we have a huge rejection rate. 2/3 of the applicants are denied for their benefits. Only about 1/3 of them are approved. So you're looking at some significant, I think, drawback for these people. And they get tied up in this reapplication and review process that could take up to 2 years to resolve. And some of these applicants actually die before they actually receive the benefit. So that is a really serious problem from an administrative standpoint, because it's a very costly program for the government to deploy, because I think 3/4 of their budget is spent towards just administering all these things. So I think QE has some really significant contributions to this area that we can really need to explore. So,
Great, thank you, Nancy. So Mamta, you work in a corporate setting where you do QE research on healthcare education. How does your QE work interface with product design and other goals at your company?
Well, hello everyone. I think I know most of you, and for anyone who I haven't met or just recently met, I am Mamta Shah, and I'm a learning scientist at Elsevier, and I'm a part of the Applied Learning Sciences research team within the Nursing and Health Education division. So my role is, I guess, in some ways not very different from what an academic would do in the university setting. You know, I'm tasked with building a research program. And I remember in 2019, I was a part of the early career workshop at ICQ, and I was speaking with David and Karin, and just sort of exploring, what is that one sort of seed that I must sow? And I had many ideas, and here I am having several research studies that I'm really excited to talk about, and having built a collaborative research team with Amanda Stewart, Evenstone, Brendan Egan, and several of my internal collaborators, or nursing educators, product designers, several times their marketing and sales colleagues who take interest in our research studies. So I guess I'll say a couple of things. One of them is the research has been very collaborative, and it's been almost like building a program of research where I started with a desire for this one proof of concept that would allow people to see how we can examine the rich learning that happens in the simulations that are designed for nursing and health education students. And started with this one case study just demonstrating the kinds of complex learning that we can visualize and assess, and actually sort of help nursing educators understand that all the things that you're seeing in your, feeling in your gut that you know that your students are learning, you don't have to rely on your gut. You can actually assess them, visualize them, you can make statistical claims, you can actually point to that piece of data and say, look, it's not just number crunching, it's actually you can point to this piece of evidence and say, this is where my student was recognizing cues or analyzing cues, and this is where they were doing both. But it started with this need for showing that one piece of evidence and helping people move from the abstract of what QE is and what it can do, like what does it mean to translate big data into meaning, especially in the nursing context, to then almost moving that abstract to the concrete and saying, okay, now we can actually test it in different sort of settings and we can ask them questions. So being in this very unique spot of being the central figure, and I had this vantage point of listening to Brendan and Amanda and several of our QE researchers who have unique interests in specific domains or have interest in specific methodologies and develop new methodologies. So sort of keeping an ear on that on one end, and then keeping the other ear on the side of the business. Like, what are my colleagues talking about? What are some issues in nursing education? Issues of assessment, issues of where are the gaps in assessment, where are the gaps in what nursing educators want to see or do or be empowered with. And also, what are some of the business priorities? Like, what are some products that might actually benefit from novel methodologies like QE? Like, having that 360-degree view and almost like being in that epistemic network myself, trying to make connections between those different nodes has been very fruitful, because that is what led us to finding new opportunities and asking new questions. So we started with this one case study to then actually going out and studying how teachers are using virtual reality simulations in nursing education. Are they actually able to leverage the benefits of simulation for the clinical goals that matter to them? Similarly, we want to see if students are actually making the, sort of having a meaningful trajectory over specific times in simulation sessions. The other things that I then led to from these initial studies is that, okay, we're looking at this one modality of simulation. What if we start looking at different modalities? What does it look like when a content is being fed to two different products? Can we start looking at alignment of content? Can we look at large volumes of text, and not just discourse data, but now text content? And I remember that presented an opportunity for a client, what Amanda did in her dissertation, the alignment approach. We looked at text data from two different products. And then it's sort of been like a zigzag moment as I talked with Brendan about that. we've always looked at product as this design curriculum, but the way we approach it has been sometimes from a lens of the planned curriculum, like what does it look like from how we design it, to then sometimes focusing on the enacted curriculum, what does it look like in practice, and who is it benefiting at what times, and what can we reveal that would otherwise, not be possible through some of the more traditional methods. And I guess more recently we've started delving into understanding what happens when a product is a standalone product in the sense that it is designed to not really need the intervention of a teacher. How does it stand its ground in supporting supporting students, and what does it look like for students practicing specific skills? How does the context stay out? So we're able to unfold a lot of them, and that's sort of leading to a lot more studies like can be compared to different modalities of simulation. Can we now explore the use of transformative data and ordered network analysis? It's really been building off from each study and then also working with different consumers at different levels, because yes, the final audience in any report is the nursing educators or administrators or students, but there are several consumers in between. I am situated in an industry context, and ultimately, my work has to make sense to people in there first before it can make sense to the customers. And so it's my job to understand, whether the marketing folks understand what I'm writing, whether it's a conference paper or whether it's a white paper or a research paper. If they're finding it hard to understand, it's my job to strip down the complexity, because I was having this very nice conversation with John yesterday, that my role is not necessarily to be a hero, by writing glorious papers. Yes, everyone likes to do innovative research, and we all like to, sort of shine in that respect. But if I can sort of strip down the complexity and really break down it to the level where this is what we did, but here's a value for you as a nursing educator, this is what I want you to take from it, then I think my role is served even more than what it would traditionally be.
Great, thank you, Mamta. And then lastly, Sanna, you've studied how AI can contribute to self-regulated learning. What do you find promising about QE as a methodology in that work?
Thank you. First of all, good morning, everyone. I'm a learning scientist, and I've been always interested in understanding how people learn, not necessarily how much they learn. And especially in my lab, we have been working for better self-regulated learning in collaborative learning setting, because in general, I believe in collaborative learning, and secondly, self-regulated learning is the most powerful way of boosting your agency for your whole life and be a authentic learner. In that field, self-regulated learning is an old topic and very strong theory, but it is also a very complex phenomena, especially considered in collaborative as a social phenomena, because it has it is metacognitive, very, very human phenomena, something you are not able to measure, something which is not easily visible for learners or for researchers, for teachers to help. Therefore the field has had problems to measure it and also make kind of metrics to help bring, for example, technology to help that. And now recent years, data has been very important for us. Also, technology is always part of that. So we collect data with different data channels, physiological data, eye tracking videos, and so on, log data, of course. So data helps us to get evidence of certain processes like cognition, motivation, emotion, and certain kind of phenomena like adaptation or cyclical process which is not able to visualize. But the problem has been that what do we do with this data? And how this data can be explained with the concepts we have. And currently we believe we are very early, but ENA, for example, could be a possible way to open this complexity and especially explain the co-occurrences of some issues like how affect and emotions and condition interact. So that in the scientific sense that's important, but I also would like to mention that eventually, of course, we want to help learners to be more powerful, and educational technology is way for that. But unfortunately, even though the whole world has been working like 30 years in educational technology, we haven't still been able to solve the problem. And there is so much the educational technology in markets which is not at all evidence-based. So therefore, we are looking to the future and the role of AI and how learners and AI could collaborate and to help children, adults, everyone to train more of these self-regulated learning skills. But first we have to have this data and understand how these data match to the phenomena we really want to help. And recently, for example, we established a global research center called SELA, which is Center for Learning and Living with AI. I'm leading it together with Inna Molina, and we have a global team trying to boost this research. And I think that currently the issue we are wrestling with this method is something very promising that we want to dive in deeper, and I think it helps us.
Great, thank you, Sanna. So I think as these intros have shown, all four of the panelists are really wrestling at that cutting edge of how to make research inform practice and policy in new ways. Maybe we can just dive a little bit deeper. In any study of policy or practice, there are different constituencies, often have conflicting interests, and researchers may try to improve processes even within a practice or policy that they might be even critical of. So how do you negotiate these tensions in your own work, and are there key approaches that help you do that? So anybody's welcome to start.
Give it a go. So, taking aside activism and trying to change the system, that is a very valid alternative, but it's not mine. I usually work inside established public systems. What I've seen is that when researchers try to create change to public systems, they face this impossible space of phases on the policy cycle. Some of them are active, some of them are not, and they don't know it. So it's either we're in a lawmaking space, we are creating the mandate of the next government through the elections, we're evaluating policies, we're in the budget stage, and you don't know about that, you don't know how to navigate. Each one of these stages then has instruments, and these instruments were built during the new public management era, this 20 years ago, trying to bring methods from the business space to make the government more efficient, as they said. So it's not up for quantitative research, it's oriented in a different way. And each one of these phases with this instrument then have a number of players with frameworks and skills. And so it is impossible for you to navigate this. And that the reality is that the only way to influence is through partnerships with insiders. And if insiders don't know what you do, if insiders don't understand your methods, that becomes an impossible task. And if you want to be influential, I guess there are a couple of things to do. The public services have massive training budgets. They're not used strategically, so you have a chance to teach a large number of public servants about your methods, create a relation, as you were saying, the familiarity of the public sector with your methods. It's a way to create change. And there's the other case, when we are looking for researchers. In that case, and this is purely my experience, but I've seen some patterns of self-exclusion that I think are not positive. So usually they take the form of, I don't want to compromise the integrity of my research. Well, that's fantastic, but we're in a short span of time trying to solve a problem that is in an instrument. So we need to make those things fit, or we need a more participatory approach, or the timing of this research is not good, or we have a larger problem. That's usually something that I've heard a lot. So your institution or your partners, something that's not part of the task that we're facing, comes between you collaborating with us. And I think part of the problem is this goes to the negotiation is that those attitudes tend to be rewarded by their peers. So, and validated, and you did the right thing by not compromising any of the things that you're doing. And the opposite happens when someone takes the call and works in a very short span of time to try to improve the results of the public policy. And in this span of self-exclusion, what it's producing is that those who take the call are usually those who think that with a big data model and AI in a couple of weeks, they can understand everything. So you're giving a lot of space to those types of responses. So again, my insider point of view is that you need to build alliances in the long term to receive the call, and then I will ask for some flexibility so you can be more influential instead of excluded.
I'm going to plus one on the alliances part. Because I feel like no one's ever going to know everything about everything. And I'm by no means a nursing education expert. I've learned a lot by working with a lot of nursing educators, but I'm still a learning scientist, and I can say for the better part of my system, I've been a generalist who has taken a lot of interest in education technology. But your question about policy, I feel like the way it has worked for me, I've tried to understand policy from a variety of angles. Like there's this, I know that within nursing education, there's this wave of emphasis on competency-based education. All right, where is it coming from? There's a shortage of nursing. We know that nurses, especially in the early sort of stages, are not as prepared for clinical sort of practice. All right, maybe that's where it's stemming. So like sort of finding these issues and seeing if they have any connection, or like is this leading to like some sort of policy change, and then understanding what kinds of frameworks are being recommended, like what kinds of cognitive skills or socio-emotional skills or just different constructs that are being put out there as being valued, or theoretical frameworks. And again, trying to like every time like piece the pieces together, like okay, there's competency-based education, there's this quality and safety sort of framework, and there's a clinical judgment framework. How do they speak with each other? And again, like I can look at a framework and I can understand things. Like, what are they trying to model? Like, what's the connection? But in practice, what does it look like? I'm not the best person to say that. So that's where the alliances. I mean, at every step, alliances make a huge difference. But especially when I can read papers and I can understand. Okay, what are the big arguments that are being made? I can read policy documents, statements by the Board of Nursing or other sort of regulatory bodies. I can read documents and make sense, but it's the nursing educators that I partner with, whether they're within my company or outside my company, and trying to understand what are the pain points for them. And when they listen to all these big changes, what are they listening? Like, how are they seeing it in practice? What are they hoping that this policy will look like in practice? When an educator is, the way I see it is that the way they interact with policy is sometimes the content that they have access to. Like, is the content helping them bridge the standards that they need to meet, or certain competencies that they need to meet? Is it empowering them to bridge that gap, that meta gap, and sort of fill the void and help them, while simultaneously also have their students become enculturated in the professional praxis? And then I was like, what is the content that we are getting access to that also I have access to, and those are the products. So that is again like this whole conversation between many people, many sort of sources, oftentimes leads to ideas around, okay, maybe this is where maybe like we want to bring in QE, because we can look at vast volumes of text and look at whether the content in a certain product is aligned to the constructs that are valued in nursing, because they are meant to sort of fill that void in policy. And again, like where we are right now is to be aligned, or we sort of map the alignment, but now we want to see what it looks like in practice. So it's been like a constant conversation with just many different factors, human and non-human.
Okay. I think the effect to the policy from the research I do and our field is more like indirect, because if we are able to understand more about these processes and the outcomes these processes made, then we are able to explain what makes you a successful learner and what is needed to help. So in that way, the progress that quantitative ethnography is pushing the field is very important. And actually, I see a lot of optimistic or a lot of light in that sense, that how research is really changing policy at the moment, because currently, for example, the next PISA 2025 will be learning in the digital world measure. And first time it is more focusing on understanding the learning processes and collecting data about these complex processes, not measuring how much or ranking according to the learning results. And I think this is a very powerful measure to different countries also to change the pedagogical solutions and help learners in practice, not to compete that who is the best in the learning results. But before we are able to really take this revolution and change the educational practices for more active learning models, there are still issues we need to work in research, and therefore like using this data and these complexities we have in our field, but these powerful methods, they together hopefully, and I'm very optimistic, will do progress.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think our experience has not been quite so simple, in the sense that when we started delving into this data, first of all, we first analyzed, I think, the user-generated data from all these about 7 online forums that contain something like 150,000 quotes and sentences that, my project assistants here could actually, attest to that fact. And what happened was that the first epistemic network analysis that we conducted were between conversations of people whose applications were approved versus those who were denied, which, as I said, is a significant portion of the applicants. So what we were able to identify is really quite revealing, that because the Disability Benefits Office defined, they call it the Blue Book, with 11 disabilities that they recognize as being eligible for this kind of benefits. However, certain conditions dominate the ones who were rejected. So from that standpoint, it was very interesting to see what kind of conditions were denied and what kind of conditions were approved. So it ultimately leads to the fact that it's the applicant's ability to document their disability that is easily diagnosed with the medical evidence, and the application will go through because it's easy. So with that alone, I guess you realize that the more difficult it is to diagnose, it means that they need to access to their medical records. But the healthcare system is as such that it's not an easy thing for these applicants to get hold of. So you have the medical systems here that is not exactly helpful. And then you're up against, I think, the benefits office is actually approved at the state level, even though the policy is federal by nature. It's administered by a federal government, but it's the state governments that actually make the approval and do all these adjustments. And I realized that, okay, the state, I think, benefits office are under pressure to make sure that they also need to defend themselves, because if they approve a case that was ultimately denied, they get into trouble. And the thing is, so they go for the obvious cases that is easily, supported by the medical evidence that they get approved. And so the system has an incentive to reject difficult cases. And that's why so many of them get tied up in the system. And what epistemic network analysis allowed us to do is to actually start identifying where the bottleneck is. And that took us to, I think, through the help of Brandon, I worked with social workers now, because the thing is that the social workers were able to explain to me, this is the process that they go through in applying for this. And that was when we realized it was an 8-page document that would require you to actually define what is your disability, and in order to assess your ability to work. So that was the incentive, but it is so difficult to define and measure. That was when we realized this is what the applicants are up against. And so then we reach out to the Social Security Administration because they have the computer science people and the database maintenance asking for some statistics to see whether these are where the bottleneck is, because it seems to suggest that, when you look at the questions, it's like we understand that they are trying to use these measures to assess people's ability to work. However, if you were being asked those questions, you would actually be offended by the fact that you're being treated like an invalid or someone who is mentally deficient and all that. There are all these questions that is really quite probing, and so you wonder about privacy issues and all that. So, but anyway, so you're dealing with the different constituents, the social workers, the state governments, the medical certification systems, and ultimately the administration, who actually, we waited for months to get that data to see, because based on the information that gets collected, we sense that these are the bottleneck, and we wanted to see if there is a way that process could be improved to actually yield better information, and we never heard about that. So we were forced to just go ahead and going back to the social workers to hopefully get that information. And here's the other thing that, it was posed to us in the sense that when we presented some of these findings, I think the government has an incentive to make it difficult. It's like type 1, type 2 error. Do you want to actually allow benefits for people who otherwise are actually not eligible because they are always concerned about fraud? Even though fraud is a very small percentage of that. So they actually make the system really cumbersome for you to, that burden of proof in order for you to be approved. And that is very not so easy to actually circumvent. And it is also, bear in mind that the social disability systems is the most expensive benefit program run by the government. It's because if a person, and again, the definition of disability has changed over the years when, because industrial occupations change. So they have not updated the systems of actually defining disabilities. And so people become disabled at a much younger age, which means that the government would be actually supporting them throughout until they age into, I think, the retirement system. So the earlier they become disabled, the costlier it is for the government to continue to support them. So it is not an I guess all we can do is to actually present the data and the evidence. But again, I think QE is such a new method. And as I discussed with Juan before, because I'm often talking to an entire room full of economists, and that is not a process and the kind of data that they would understand. But unfortunately, I think the policy and the governments are completely driven by economics policies and that rely on a completely different lens to look at the situation.
Yeah, and presumably one advantage of QE is that when you are talking to people who really only pay attention to quantitative models, it gives you a way to represent data that they wouldn't otherwise be interested in or look at in a way that they can interact with.
Yes.
And I think this is actually a great segue to our next question, and I think after that we'll open it up to the audience. But QE researchers are particularly concerned with fairness. And I think that operates on a number of levels. Fairness in terms of the methods themselves, fairness as a lens through which to examine different topics, so in the case of disability. And all of you have sort of touched on this, as well. And of course, there's fairness at the global scale. There's the parity between the global north and the global south, for example. And so all of you have sort of already touched on this a little bit, but I wonder if you can say a bit more, about how you think about fairness and the work that you're doing and how it informs, the way that you approach, that work.
Okay, seconds.
Anybody in the room?
I think you just answered the question. And I bring in more alternative hypotheses to why things are happening. They're not necessarily represented in the data that we have today or the analysis that we have today. Just a very brief brief story. During the last two presidential campaigns away in my country, the president said that he was going to finance his new reforms by scrapping programs that were poorly evaluated. And he mentioned one program by name, so that program was doomed. Then I was assigned to evaluate that program. So, the program was the largest job training program for vulnerable women in my country. It was a massive thing. And the data showed that the probability of improving your chance to get an employment, your salary, or to get back to formal education was very low, so the results were poor in general. But as you were saying, the guts tell you other things, and people on the ground were saying that, you know what, this is increasing their self-esteem in ways that you can measure. That this is affecting a reduction of domestic violence, the kids are having a better time, they're doing better, they're having better results. I don't know how to measure those results in school. So what the guts were saying was another story, and we didn't have that mechanism of making the guts talk to the decision makers. So one way that this creates fairness is by allowing these alternative views to be a part of the conversation in a space of equality. And also it challenged to those who are making the assumption of why things work or why things are not working. The hypothesis of why this program were not working, built again by economists that most of my friends are economists, so I'm not going to, but they have some bias. Well, so the hypotheses were, one, as we are paying this woman for their time while they're training because they're not working, and because we're paying for the child caring during the program. These incentives are enough for people that are not motivated to get a job to be in the program. That was hypothesis one. The second hypothesis was that those providing the training, they were not paid for the results, so they were trying to lower the cost. Both hypotheses are not, from my guts and my experience, true. Those who are delivering the training are often NGOs, some of them religious, quite committed with their communities. They were really looking to make a change, and those who are in the programs are really trying to get a job. The alternative hypothesis and alternative point of view were not part of the conversation, and I think this brings fairness by opening up to a more participatory approach and to alternative ideas.
The way fairness sort of plays out in my work has been, again, different levels. One part of it could be fairness in the process. While we're conducting the research, or maybe even like in the very early stages, there's of course a lot of data, and once we're sort of seeped in the data and some clusters of stories are starting to emerge, asking ourselves, what is the story that we want to foreground? And if we decide to do that, who's going to benefit? Why is it important? What are we upholding when we are deciding to foreground this story versus another one that seems to be equally promising or interesting? So having those kinds of conversation and devoting time to that before saying, oh, this looks like this is a winning sort of story, and we must go for it. So creating, a team environment where these conversations are a part of the process and not just I really think we should not talk about whether we should say this. Making that an integral part of the team conversation. And it doesn't have to be only quantitative ethnographers who are at the table. It's everyone who's on the team, whether it's the product manager who I'm working with and who I'm trying to explain hey, we want to get this data and want to study it, involving them, nursing educators who we are partnering with, sometimes some other kinds of, colleagues. So having those conversations, and also when we're presenting some ideas hey, here are some stories that are standing out for us, what do you think might be most interesting for nursing educators? And if so, why? Same questions get asked to the product managers, what do you think, does this story make sense towards what you want people to know about your products, from a learning standpoint? So fairness in process, and then fairness in communication. Whether it's an academic paper going to a more academic audience, or a white paper or a research brief, how are we writing, and is the language accessible, and yes, of course, transparency in the process, like what was done, why did we do it, what did we find, and also like, what does it mean for you? Like if we can, like if someone can read my paper and again, like at the end of it, if I can like give them like 5 big takeaways that will help them improve their practice or think about using a certain technology in a different way in the curricula, I think those are ways in which I strive to apply fairness in my work.
Perhaps my point to this fairness discussion is that in this big data discussion we have currently, we should not forget little person or little human, because humans are not machines. We don't act like machines. We are very unique. We are. I don't believe that we are ever able to develop a robot which is smarter than in terms of sensitivity of thinking and emotions and affect. And even though this wonderful power of data and AI can predict a lot and model and all these wonderful sequences and so on, they tell us a lot about, for example, our learning strategies and so on. But we don't act always like that, because most of the learning issues is very contextual, and we know from theories that actually beliefs play a lot of role, not the behavior or action in that situation. And therefore, this having more power of discussion about this quantitative ethnography aspects to contextualize something, what we see in a bigger screen, let's say so, and really believe that the human really in the context makes a difference and explains. So I think that brings fairness to this big data discussion.
What I guess our research seems to be really revealing is the fact that you see sort of disparity or unfairness, in this process for the applicants at the application process, at the appeal process, and so I guess at the application process, whether these applicants have the actually knowledge to be able to actually submit their application successfully and have the access to the medical systems to get the medical evidence that they need in order to support that particular application. And it's interesting that because I think most of them rely on mail services in those days, and I think the reply to them is actually sent to them in the mail, whether it is approved or denied, and they have a 60 days window to respond to it. But some of the applicants are living in homeless shelters, so they don't even have a mailing address to get access to something like that. So, and then the government come up with the iClaim system so that you can actually submit your applications through the, online. However, that would also predicate on the fact that you need to have online access. Mm-hmm. So what happens if you are in this situation that, and it's not an easy thing to fill out something on a smartphone. You need a computer to be able to have reliable online access. So if you live in a rural area or if you're homeless, that becomes pretty challenging. So you have that kind of disparity at the application stage. And during the appeal and the review stage, those who are able to understand that, okay, if you were to find legal representation to actually help you navigate those particular channels and knowing what evidence you need to produce, your likelihood of getting this thing approved would be higher. But I think for someone who is not familiar with the legal system, to know that they are actually lawyers who can represent you and work on a contingency basis, but unfortunately they take 25 to 30% of your payment. But at least you will get it approved. So, but you see, so I think the evidence suggests that there are all these different difficulty of accessing the systems, and we sense that I guess the systems actually is unfair to certain type of applicants, education, geographic, and gender and various other aspects. And so I guess, unfortunately, so we've tried to ask the questions, do you have the data on, I think, the rejections in terms of the, ethnic and I think geographic distributions? And the answer we get is, We don't collect that data. Because we cannot determine the ethnicity, because the questions do not ask for ethnicities, and we cannot actually decipher the ethnicity of the applicants. The only thing we have is their names and their social security numbers, so that's not telling us very much. So I guess I see that inequity sort of like being replicated at every stage of the system. It's a difficult problem.
So we, I think, have 10 to 15 minutes or so for audience questions. I think this has been a very stimulating discussion so far. I'm guessing there are plenty of questions out there. Does anybody have one for the panel?
I'm always willing to break the ice. So one of the things that struck me across your stories is, so I had been thinking about QE as a way of bringing in other people to the conversation. But it sounds almost like the way that you're talking about it is it brings other perspectives, which comes sometimes from other people. But it's that there are certain kinds of data, certain information, certain things that can't get into the system because we don't have ways of measuring it, we don't have ways of representing it. And I guess my question is, if we have a tool that will bring some other perspective, the perspective of learning processes, the perspective of the actual participants in the community of a program, the people who are unable to get out to people. How do we, now, if we can get that information, how do we actually get it into the system? You mentioned, Juan, that partnerships, but what's the actual, but practically speaking, if somebody has, if we have this way of, how do we enact it? Because I think as researchers, our answer is, well, we publish our results. But that's not really what we're talking about here, and it's not sufficient. So I'm just wondering how we bridge that gap.
May I answer your last question?
Yeah.
How we bridge that gap? So I think the first step, again, is you're going to need people that understand your process on the other side. So I think training in the public sector is going to be essential. Then, if they understand what you can do for public officials, they will invite you to some of their processes. And again, bring this matrix of faces and instruments, but in the policy evaluation that I was describing, I was unable to bring the self-esteem conversation, but now with methods I can. So I'm going to have an opening in the program evaluation by saying, well, there's a statistically significant difference. Well, I know that story because your methods allow me to have that conversation. And each one of the phases have their own instruments, and their instruments are, if we are smart enough, we can permeate those systems with your methodologies. But that's something that it's case by case, policy by policy, country by country, instrument by instrument. So the need for alliances is even larger than my thing originally is.
So can I just follow? So it sounds like what you're saying is that for Nancy's work to impact the Social Security Administration, somehow she would have to actually train people on the other side of the Social Security system to understand how some of these methodologies work.
Initially, yes, but then you can scale to change the instruments. So instead of the Social Security official, we're talking about the budget office, or we're talking about the delivery unit that is measuring how the program is moving, then changes disperse cross-sectionally around government. Do you mind if I bring up very
That should be
So it's just like, I don't believe this is how economic and statistical analysis permeated decision makers. It's not like you train the minister in fixed effect estimation and then they said, okay, this works, now let's just follow this. It's a more kind of political and ideology permeated process from the Chicago school down. I have my own, in fact, that's going to be my question to the panel. Like, aren't you afraid that you are in a kind of general equilibrium moment. Like economics was also qualitative studies until the 1820s. It was called political economy, and people were really kind of in the thick of things. And then they kind of fell back on this very simple math that was cutting edge then in the 1780s. You know, all they had was calculus, so they did calculus, and calculus was elegant, and you know, that kind of justified a lot of very dubious methodological choice. And here you are now, right? Simple network analysis, AI, and you know, aren't you afraid that this will corrupt ethnography and make it become some kind of, you know, another quantitative, very dubious discipline 100 years down the line?
My comeback to that is the fact that they are actually interested, that's why they are funding this research. And because this is the perspectives and the insights that they cannot glean from the kind of existing data that they have. And I think what we need to do is that, and actually it comes from the president's office and everything, that because this problem has become so bad that we need to, there is a management of quality control that actually demands that we need to improve our service to, I think the general public. So because of all these rejection rates and all the difficulties that the applicants are going through. So there is at least some incentive for service improvement. We call it, they said you should take an example from the service industry, because these people are your customers as well in terms of the service delivery. How can we improve our service to these applicants? And I guess, you know, so we rely on market research ideas to think about perhaps, you know, just doing it slightly. I guess if you were just to say that our research points to this particular bottleneck. So maybe if we can just provide some guide, and you know, in the online application, you can actually give some helpful suggestions to say that this is how you need to actually respond to this question. And you know, it's something as simple as that, just to see if we can nudge the needle a little bit to that side. And I think the people will not be convinced by anything else except for hard evidence. So you need to produce a hard evidence for these people to see that it's different. I think that's where we need to go.
Very shortly, my conclusion, I don't think we need to make a revolution collectively. I don't know whether you want to make a revolution. But already that, I think this is quite amazing that these panelists, we come from very different fields, but we still think about quite similar issues with the same methods. So if we all do a little bit progress in our fields, I think that's enough.
There's one other thing that comes to me, David, as you were asking about, like what a tool like that would look like, where all participants, or at least some of them, could come together. And I was reminded of the tool that we're using in a couple of our classes, the Pearsall social annotation tool, or hypotheses, as some of you might know. Where, you know, everyone who has access to this one document looks at it, and you can annotate it with comments, questions, responses. And then I was drawn to this other aspect that Amanda, Brendan, and I routinely do with all of the people who are a part of any QE project, is we have this running Google Doc, where everything that we write or say, whether it's our thoughts or, you know, just random sort of, you know, ideas that we may be considering, and then as a, you know, sort of a report formulates, or like as we're starting to put together pieces, we actually invite many of our stakeholders to comment, to read, not just when the final paper is ready, but even as we're like drafting some ideas, like, does this make sense? Like, you know, we're framing this. And we're not necessarily interested at that time for them to just say, oh, look, like statistically significant findings. Ooh. You know, it's really the ethnographic piece. Like, these are the kinds of meanings that are coming out of these connections. Is the way we're communicating making sense? Like, what questions do you have? What should we clarify? So really just having that social annotation aspect built into, and again, there are so many parts to QE, right? So like, what part do you want? I guess one has to ask themselves, like, at what point do you actually want everyone to come together and start sharing stories? Is there at specific times, and what does it look like? What kind of support you want to build? But that's how I envision could be like a good way to also build capacity, because then it's like this one central thing that you know, sort of bring people towards.
which I think also speaks to this, to the other question about, what happens if the E part sort of just falls out and all you're left with is the model, is that I think, this field in general has increasingly actually emphasized the kind of the role of perspectives or participants or both, in not just kind of rubber stamping the final output, but actually being involved at different stages of the process. And as with any method, it can be implemented well or poorly, and anything in between. And we don't, even those of us who are trying to do it right every time don't always do everything, perfectly. But I think that idea, which I hear come through in all of your responses, I think has been a very strong one here, and is probably the best chance we have to prevent things from devolving into just another kind of modeling, right? That would otherwise be indistinguishable from any other form of modeling that people do. And I think the fact that we can continue to have these conversations and talk about how we do that better is, I think, really important, because it will keep those perspectives in the
I think we're already doing some of it, like Mike's work with teachers, Girl and Hazel's work, where they're inviting their participants to annotate models and sort of modify them if need be. And I think we're already doing that at many different levels. And several of us share how we are involving our participants in different capacities.
So I think we might have time for one more question. That was more of a comment than a question.
Yes, you can.
That's great.
I think it's just a follow-up to the previous question. I'd like to look at the other side of the story, because we talk here about us making an effort to reach out, but what about policymakers reaching out to us, or actually the opposite case, being resistant to evidence-based approaches? Could you reflect a little on how QE could actually contribute to persuading policymakers that evidence-based approaches are the way to go?
I can see that a bit. I feel like there's this big shift in industry actually in favor of evidence-based practices, particularly in supporting the claims we make about any, I use the word products, but essentially it's, in EdTech, it's learning solutions or learning environments that we're building. And whether it's K-12, which is probably the highest sector of EdTech, but even within higher ed or workforce education, there's actually more and more people from every different levels of the ecosystem want evidence-based practices. And I can sort of make a grand claim here within nursing education. Like I'm only like 4 years into this field and applying quantitative ethnography, but I know Brendan can attest to it, is that like nursing educators and administrators, I've also worked with directors of clinical and simulation, they love this book. Like, and they want to see it more. They're like, just involve us in more studies, like, try with different kinds of products. So in my experience, there has not been resistance. In fact, actually, it almost is a responsibility on my part now to do better in terms of communication. Like I've actually had to not relearn, but like almost like build a new muscle in how I communicate my findings, so that I actually speak to a policy maker, I speak with an administrator, I speak with a teacher, I speak with, hopefully a student who's probably interested in what's happening in nursing education. So I feel like, I don't think there's resistance in the evidence-based practices per se, but I feel like if there has to be a way to bridge that tension is to find ways to effectively communicate what they're doing so that it makes sense to them. Because ultimately people are looking for something meaningful that they can take back to their classroom or to their program and make a case for getting this learning program for their curriculum. So I feel like it's that effectiveness in communication that will help bridge any tensions in evidence-based practices.
I guess my reaction to that question would be, well, first of all, I think to be fair, the government would not trust evidence that it did not collect itself. In the sense that, and the unfortunate thing is that the way they collect evidence and information is outdated. because there are a lot of critical information that they are not collecting. And hence, I think QE provide that other side of the perspective. So I don't expect them to adopt the information that we provide because it seems so difficult I think it's not something that they're used to grappling with. But I think there are other ways of using these information and the insights that QE provides to help them actually improve on their existing policies or at least the way they administer it to actually provide that evidence. I think you need to show that a proof of concept would be good to be able to actually nudge the needle in that direction, because I don't expect the policies to change.
My point is that if we are able to simplify complex things, then it's easy to discuss, because to be honest, I think quite often we try to pretend that we understand complex things, or we believe that we understand them, but we don't. So if we are able to visualize or simplify complex things, either communication in between groups, practice, teachers, learners, policy, communities, makes it more easy.
If your question is how are we going to deal with resistance and acceptance from policymakers to communication, we can analyze two sides: the self-survey interest of policymakers and the collective interest that they are looking to produce. On the self-serving side, there's a lot of walls being built to protect your position, because you know this specific thing that happens a lot with, again, budget offices where all officials trained a long time ago trying to maintain their power to prevent it happens a lot. And in that case, your ally is the other guy who is trying to challenge the assumption. It's a game. But also on the self-interest side, some of them are assigned to questions about hate speech, discrimination, growing inequalities online that you can't crack if you don't analyze this way. So you have an opportunity, because the task that they're being assigned is clearly aligned with the methods we are talking about here. I can think about, I talked about this yesterday with some of you, but the case of regulators on the gambling industry, when kids are being gambling in the video games, and they need to understand the conversation, to understand the motivation to do this, to tackle the problem. They can't do it without some of your methods. More on the collective interest, I think, again, there's a genuine motivation to solve these problems, and there's genuine caring sometimes for the situation, this gut feeling that they can express. So if you're giving them an alternative to show that, I think you're going to lower some of the barriers.
Can I say one more?
Yeah, one last comment.
Yeah,
Right,
but I have two things. I think within the community, I think that we're already starting to do, and I think we can do more. One of them is, like Abby and Sarah and you and I got together to start putting a resource for how do we communicate quantitative ethnography research or practice policy in health professionals, education, and healthcare. I think as our community grows, finding friends who do work in similar areas, and how can we create a collective voice that we can not only take back at our home institutions, but also sort of enlighten, for example, in your work, sort of broaden people's perspective on what are the different applications of QE in healthcare. So I think if more people start coming together and writing these thought leadership pieces, I think that would be a really nice way to collectively build sort of strength and evidence and voice. The second thing, I think the OpenSig community has these sandbox events that are happening every month. And Sylvie, Brendan, myself, and several of us are getting together every month, but it's open for everyone. And there is no expectation for you to know, sort of have a certain level of methodological knowledge or anything. I mean, you could be totally new to QE. That has also opened this rich space for just talking about the work. There is no expectation that you have to come with data or you have to come with a solid presentation. Yes, there is a presenter who sort of leads a focus of the discussion. So I guess participating in those events and just letting people know sometimes sometimes it's hard for us to go to every paper or read every paper, but these OpenSig events have been really fun. Sandbox events have been really fun to just learn about different people, what they're thinking, what are they dreaming of in the future. So I have to make a plug for that.
All right, well, please join me in thanking our panelists for this